We've looked at Telecomsoft themselves, we've done Odin, and now, in the third instalment of the Telecomsoft universe, it's time to strip everything down and visit a genre of games that, for a few years, certainly had its time in the sun. There'll be no platforming here, or much in the way of arcade sensibilities, because we're going to visit the realm of the text adventure. And we're looking specifically at a British company that tried to beat the most popular and most advanced creators of these stories from across the pond at their own game. And hell, they were definitely right up there with them at times. Magnetic Scrolls wanted to achieve as much as possible when it came to these journeys that you'd navigate with the help of a text parser. While text adventures were quite popular indeed in the UK, Magnetic Scrolls looked beyond the often more limited games that were successful on these shores and towards America, particularly the work of Infocom, for their measuring stick on just what made a successful text-based game. They paired up with Telecomsoft, specifically Rainbird, in order to bring their works to as many people as possible. They did quite a lot of pioneering and technically excellent things in their time, and they also had something unique and kind of groundbreaking in these times. A charismatic and very outspoken leader by the name of Anita Sinclair, one of the few women bosses of a game studio in what was generally quite the male-dominated world. Even as the inexorable movement of progress gradually limited their audience, Magnetic Scrolls would carry on defiantly until it wasn't possible to do so anymore, and their story is definitely worth telling. And so, here it is, the story of Magnetic Scrolls. Get comfy. Today's video is sponsored by Wireframe, the monthly magazine that doesn't just cover the latest games, but goes inside of them. It has features on great games, both old and new, many an enlightening piece on the history of games and their creators, and it also encourages people to get into the art of game development themselves, with articles on how to recreate famous games, mechanics, and features in engines such as Unreal in their unique toolbox section. It comes complete with beautiful, glossy artwork and opinion pieces from various key people in the industry. Oh, and me. That's what you'll find, along with a whole lot more, every month in Wireframe Magazine, the magazine that lifts the lid on video games. To subscribe, visit wfmag.cc/KimJustice in the description, and I thank them for their support today. Before we really kick into the realm of Magnetic Scrolls, a bit of context is required when it comes to text adventures, and how successful they were here in the UK on the popular microcomputers. Now, for most people, the first name that springs to mind when it comes to text adventures is Infocom. These folks are, of course, the undisputed masters of the field. Their games are legendary, the freedom granted by their text parsers was quite something for games like this, and in the days before adventure games got more graphic, they were huge. In America, anyway. The success of Infocom doesn't factor a great deal in this story as far as the UK goes, because for quite a long time we simply didn't have their games on the shelves. Infocom games didn't officially come to the United Kingdom until 1986, after the company had been bought by Activision and kind of after the company's glory days. Infocom will certainly have a part to play in this story, but the average person didn't know them from Adam. So what did we have? While all the 8-bit micros had their fair share of text adventures, it's fair to say that if you were a fan of the genre over here, you would likely be playing most adventures on the Spectrum, where hundreds if not thousands of these games were released. The first major one of note for a lot of people, on the Specky anyway, would be Melbourne House's The Hobbit. It was originally released there and then ported everywhere. The game was certainly a big hit. It's got graphics to go along with the text parser, one that was quite advanced for the Spectrum at the time, although, well, if you were to compare this to an average game that Infocom was releasing at the time, you would undoubtedly find this one to be wanting. Still, it is an important game, especially in regards to establishing the ZX Spectrum as a popular platform for the text adventure. It certainly wouldn't take too long for companies to form that would try and push boundaries with the genre, or would specialise purely in text adventures. A company called Legend in 1983 turned a hell of a lot of heads with a text and graphic adventure hybrid called Valhalla, a very popular and high-class game, and a studio that showed a lot of promise. Well, until they followed it up with the Great Space Race anyway. Other games were less complex but still popular. A lot of people are fond of Urban Upstart, an altogether cruder but more comedic adventure from 1983 that's a bit different to the bulk of the popular text adventure games that tended to be biased towards fantasy or science fiction. But before Magnetic Scrolls, the main studio that really excelled was a group called Level 9, who we'll also be looking at a little bit in this video due to their own Telecomsoft connection. This family-run studio from the West Country were the undisputed champions of the text adventure in the first half of the decade. Level 9's games were much more advanced than most of the other titles on British shelves. They had their own very polished parser that was just about on par with Infocom's, and perhaps even more impressive due to it having to be loaded in one go on cassette tape media, and they had the storytelling chops to match their outstanding technical capability. Their first trilogy of games in 1982 for the BBC Micro, Colossal Adventure, Adventure Quest and Dungeon Adventure, usually known as the Middle-earth Trilogy due to their huge influence from good old Tolkien, turned a hell of a lot of heads, and this would continue with the likes of Lords of Time, Red Moon and Return to Eden. We'll come back a bit to these folks later. Quite possibly more important than any of this though, when it comes to the ubiquity and popularity of the text adventure on the micros, is something that's not a game. It's a piece of software released in late 1983 called the Quill. The Quill was created by a man named Graham Yendall, and it allowed people to create text adventures entirely of their own. There'd be no graphics available as there were in The Hobbit or other commercial games, and the text parser certainly wouldn't be as capable, but still, the tools are here for you to write your own story. And that's exactly what people did. In 1984, the Quill was successful beyond even the wildest of expectations. Many people bought it, and studios even ended up using it. Hundreds of commercially released games, including some quite popular ones, were created entirely using the Quill. Much like The Hobbit, it wasn't too long before you'd find the Quill on every other micro-platform, and more advanced versions of the software would be released in later years. Most of the people at Welsh publishers Gilsoft expected the Quill to sell a few hundred copies at best. It ended up selling thousands of copies. With the aid of the Quill, plenty more text adventures would make their way into the market. It ensured that absolutely every magazine would require a whole chunk of their copy to be dedicated entirely to the latest titles. As with any piece of software like this, some games made with the Quill were excellent, while some were, well, not so excellent. The creator most certainly had its limitations, particularly in its original form, but that doesn't stop certain people from weaving magic with it. But of course, it's not the be-all and end-all. There'll still be those who want to create a parser and make something more complex. So with this in mind, let's introduce three teenagers: Ken Gordon, Hugh Steers and Rob Steggles. Adventure nuts, D&D enthusiasts, you name it. The year is 1983, Ken and Hugh also had a talent for coding to go along with the love of their adventure games, and Ken also had access to an Apple II at home. Now, even if Infocom games weren't commercially available over here yet, there would be a few people who were definitely aware of them, and even if the market for a computer like the Apple II was pretty frickin' small, it allowed those people to seek out and import games like Planetfall, like Hitchhiker's Guide, like the Zork series and so on. And of course, this trio absolutely loved these games, far more than the sort of thing you would generally be able to get on the UK micros. More than that, they wanted to make games just like these ones. And before too long, another person would enter the fray who would help to make this dream a reality. This particular person would be another friend of Ken Gordon's, and her name was Anita Sinclair. A couple of years older than Ken and the others, but still only 18 herself. When they got together, they all hit it off pretty quickly due to their shared love of adventures and programming. It should be said immediately that although you're probably thinking she's related to a certain Sir Clive, that was not the case. She probably had to say no relation a lot herself, especially seeing as she worked at Sinclair Research and was, in fact, Sir Clive Sinclair's PA. But before any of that, Anita Sinclair was a woman from a quite well-off background, but rather than doing the more upper-class things that were necessarily expected of her, she became enamoured with electronics, computers and programming from a young age, spending most of her teenage years hanging around computer shops and fiddling with 6502s. Anita would go on to pretty much be the head of the group that took form, and certainly one of the most visible software house bosses around during the 1980s. Now, of course, a big part of this was the anomaly side of things. While there were certainly plenty of women working in the UK industry, from great artists like Karen Davies, Ali Noble and Dawn Drake, to folks who were more in the background like US Gold and Centresoft's Anne Brown, there really weren't a whole lot in the vocal boss position, heading up the company, as well as being entirely involved in the creative and the design process. A few came along later in the decade: Jane Kavanagh at SalesCurve, Paula Byrne taking over at Telecomsoft, Vicky Khan at fellow text aficionados Mosaic Publishing, Ali Noble, once again, in the later stages of Denton Designs, but Anita was certainly one of the first, complete with the talent and charisma to put herself out there that went beyond the novelty of magazines going, "Ooh, look, here's a lady in the industry. Well, those sisters are well and truly doing it for themselves," and so on. Although, there would be plenty of that. We'll get into this a bit more later. The origin of magnetic scrolls happened during one particular late-night meeting in 1983 between Anita, Ken and Hugh Steers, another trio of youngsters getting out there, and this particular one deciding that they wanted to get in there and make those text adventures, inspired by the work of Infocom. They'd already started work on a proper bespoke parser and so forth. Anita initially thought that taking a more traditional path and doing arcade-style games might be a better idea, but she soon came around to the other pair's way of thinking, and the trio would start to set about acquiring the necessary funds to kickstart this venture, not just from familial wealth, but also from various odd jobs, including, apparently, a few unattributed arcade games that Anita Sinclair had written on freelance gigs. They also created something of a proof of concept, a bit of a legend that's never seen the light of day, a rather lewd text adventure called The Willy Affair, which according to Mark Hardesty in his classic adventurer interview with Anita from 2018, got its name from her habit of saying, "Can you pass me the Willy?" if she needed something but couldn't think of the word that she wanted to use. Excellent native coder's wit. Now you might wonder as well about the third man in the original trio from the first chapter, Rob Steggles. Well, he wasn't particularly interested in being at the head of this company, being quite the untechnical person. However, when it came to devising their first proper game, it wasn't too long before the Magnetic Scrolls trio thought of their friend and his great skill as a dungeon master in D&D games when it came to devising up scenarios for people to play through. So they got together with Rob, put him in the company as well, devised up a whole load of ideas, and Rob then spent the next few weeks taking those ideas and putting them together into a story. And then the small group pretty much spent a whole year working on making this story into a game. This is the beginnings of what would eventually become Magnetic Scroll's debut title, The Pawn. So in the most simple terms, how was something like The Pawn going to differ from a more basic text adventure? Perhaps the best way to think of it would be to see how many commands you would be able to string into that parser in one line before it just collapses and says, "Sorry, I don't understand." Most text adventures written inside of the Quill didn't go too far beyond what was usually known as verb-noun. For example, go south, open door, get key, and so on. When a parser is quite limited in this way, text adventures tend to run into a problem that designers call guess the verb. The player knows exactly what they want to do, but they need to spend a lot of time trying to find the exact combination of words that the parser is looking for so they can do it, because there's no variation. Now, if you're an impatient so-and-so like me, that's usually the point swear words start getting poured relentlessly into the parser and the game gets turned off. In straightforward game design terms, the more commands that a parser can take and interpret, the longer and more varied a sentence the player can put in, they don't have to guess the verb, and they're more immersed in the experience. And even if this is all text, creating a parser that can handle so many variable strings of commands is a lot of work indeed, hence why the development of something like The Pawn took a whole year. All of the big names in the adventure world, the Level 9s and the Infocoms, had their own complex parsers that were guarded pretty closely, and magnetic scrolls worked from scratch to build their own, although what they eventually built for the pawn is something that would keep, with the odd bit of tinkering and upgrading, for most of the rest of their adventure titles going forward. This parser would be given the codename of Eltham, named after the location of their original office in southeast London. There were a few little tricks that the Magnetic Scrolls team were fond of demonstrating when it came to the Pawns parser, things that would draw gasps from the assembled journos. One particular one that they enjoyed was, use the trowel to plant the pot plant in the plant pot. This tongue-twisting volley of commands is hard enough to say, let alone interpret, but the parser was able to handle it with no issue. Another one they liked was, tie the hoe and the rake together with the shirt, usually then followed by, lever the boulder with the rake and the hoe. And yes, these are solutions to puzzles in the game, and you may already wonder how the hell anyone would think of such things without using some sort of guide, but still, it's a pretty good string for a parser to take on. Now, it's certainly not perfect in this form. The pawn does like to use these fancy strings, and in the cases they're employed you do still kinda have to get them exactly right, otherwise the parser will misinterpret them in ways that can screw up your game far more than a simple "I don't understand the word arse" can. It's not so much guess the verb as it is guess the verbiage, and when it's combined with some of the moon logic that the puzzles in the game use, it can still get rather annoying. The magnificent Jimmy Mayer, over at the Digital Antiquarian blog, has some very good examples of how the parser in the pawn can go wrong, and how it can still frustrate the player to no end, and his writing on the pawn and many other text adventures is, for me, essential reading. Link in the description. The pawn is very good for a first attempt, but it's not quite at the level of Infocom yet. It will get better over time, mind you. Now, I've actually talked quite a lot already about the pawn's technical prowess, but I've barely even mentioned just what the game actually frickin' is, and how successful it was. So, perhaps we should do that. In the pawn, you play as a hippie, as evidenced by the plant design on your shirt, who suddenly wakes up one day in the magical kingdom of Kirovnia, with a wristband that you can't remove. There's about to be an election in this kingdom, and you, basically as the titular pawn, are going to be pushed and pulled in various directions in order to influence this democratic process in the way that the candidates want. Various things will happen in this process. You'll be relentlessly mocked and possibly murdered by a guru, kicked out of the palace by a kin for no reason at all, you'll kill someone for reasons that are questionable at best, you'll meet a horse that talks exactly like the famous TV character Mr. Ed, and you might even run into the programmers of this very game just as they're about to make their way to the pub. So yeah, the pawn isn't exactly the most po-faced of adventure games. Quite a lot of it is parody, with send-ups of various bad adventure game tropes and cliches all over the shop. A particular one that I enjoy is the endless maze that you find on your travels. If you go in, you will be utterly stuck, every direction available to you no matter what, in an utterly featureless labyrinth. But don't worry too much, simply enter exit maze, and you'll automatically leave. Things like that are still quite funny. And of course there is some of the rather silly solutions to puzzles kicking around, or the almost hilariously arbitrary you must drop everything conditions that the game occasionally sets for you, basically functioning as traps because, generally speaking, you will immediately break any item that you drop and most of them are essential. It's not a particularly kind game when it comes to the poor hero, it has to be said, but that quality can be rather funny from time to time. The pawn had a long old journey to prominence. It would take more than one version for the game to get there. While we've been using the more famous 16-bit Amiga version to show the game off so far, the pawn was actually first released on, of all platforms, Sir Clive Sinclair's glorious Quantum Leap. Yep, it's the Sinclair QL. For the utterly nascent Magnetic Scrolls, it made sense to give this a go. Anita Sinclair had that Sir Clive connection, seeing as the two were firm friends as well as former work colleagues, and the new QL was kind of struggling to attract anybody to the platform, seeing as people didn't have much of an idea whether it was a business computer or a recreational computer or, well, anything at all. Aside from abortive attempts at bringing that old mega game Bandersnatch to the platform, not a lot was happening, and so Magnetic Scrolls stepped in with this, the original version of the Pawn in 1985, one of the few games to be released on the platform through Sinclair's own label in its commercial lifespan, and normally known as QL Pawn to differentiate it from the better versions to come. Obviously, it didn't do very well, because it was on the Sinclair QL, and the big difference here between this and other versions is that there's nothing here but text. However, the Pawn did at least cause enough of a stir on the QL for people to be curious about the game, and for some folks to see about taking it away and porting it from, well, let's face it, this rather lame duck of a platform, particularly when it came to games of any kind. The Pawn may not have done all that well on the QL, but that was far from the end of the story. With Magnetic Scrolls now more established and finding new officers on Borough High Street in South London, it was time to think up the next move, seeing as they now had a release under their belt. But they weren't quite done with the Pawn yet. This was, after all, a time of transition. It's 1985, the 16-bit micros like the Atari ST and the Amiga are starting to get out there, and there had been enough good words said about Magnetic Scrolls' first adventure, even on a quite small platform, for them to think that the game had enough legs to get on another platform, ideally something like the Amiga or the Atari ST. And here's where the Telecomsoft connection comes in. Thanks to a hookup from Argonaut's Jez San, the studio got in touch with Rainbird, the wing of the company that tended to deal more with adventures and other less action-based titles, with the proposal of releasing an enhanced version of the game for the ST. Things went pretty well, seeing as Anita Sinclair and Tony Rainbird clicked together pretty quickly. While Anita again initially thought of retreating towards more arcade-friendly games, Tony didn't have a lot of interest in any of that, and instead paid a lot more attention to the adventure game that they'd already released on the QL. Thanks to the Pawn, a deal was agreed that would end up giving Magnetic Scrolls a publisher for most of their lifespan. As far as upgrading the game goes, the very simple suggestion was that the game needed some artwork. It would be a whole lot better if there were some pretty pictures to go along with the nicely written text, wouldn't it? An artist named Jeff Quill was assigned to do exactly that, creating the pictures that would set the scene and give the game a whole lot more style, creating bitmap artwork that was something wholly different to the sort of line-based start that you would see accompanying 8-bit microtext adventures. This 16-bit version of the Pawn also presents the Elton parser in a form that's probably familiar to most. The main bit of the screen is obviously dedicated to the adventure itself, but there's a menu up top. You've got your basic save, load and restart options of course, but there's some other things here. You can change how much text actually comes up, for example, whether the game's text is normal, brief or verbose. You've got quick commands to see a hint or have a look at where the exits are. There's also other options here that do make the game more accessible. You can change the size of the text to make it larger, and you can also turn speech on and off. Now obviously this is only the Amiga's computer voice, but that's still cool if you're unable to see the text yourself.
Grassy plain. This is an extensive area of grassy plain. Looking westward you can recognize the gravel path.
And as for those lovely bits of art, well, to see those you simply drag the top bar down with the right mouse button and they'll appear right in front of your eyes. Not bad, eh? Get used to this interface, because it's what you'll be seeing for most of Magnetic Scrolls games. So did the Pawn have legs on the new 16-bit micros? I think you know the answer to that. Yes, it absolutely did. It was released initially on the Atari ST, although, like a lot of Rainbird titles, it was perhaps more famous and successful on the Amiga. It also comes with a new and altogether more luxurious package. Gone is the Spartan cover of the original QL Pawn, here's wonderful box art and lots of goodies inside the box, a map of the world of Kurovnia, an extensive manual, and even a novella called A Tale of Kurovnia, written by Georgina Sinclair, Anita's sister. In this form, the game was the massive success that it absolutely deserved to be, and the beautiful art from Jeff Quill was a big selling point indeed, not just for the game, but for the computers themselves. Much like Jim Sack's famous art in Defender of the Crown, this sort of quality is not something that you're ever going to be able to get on most of the 8-bit micros, although the eventual port of the game to the Commodore 64 would do the very best it could to convert that. Also significantly, the pawn would break into North America, getting rave reviews, a whole lot of sales, and providing a text adventure that critics would consider to be on par with those of Infocom's. Suddenly Magnetic Scrolls and Rainbird are over there in 1986, waving those big old "the British are coming" flags around, and the great success of the pawn meant that there would always be some interest stateside in whatever the studio were doing. Now, Rainbird's big tilt towards the text adventure wouldn't just include Magnetic Scrolls. They made an agreement at around the same time with Level 9. This agreement, by and large, would centre around upgrading some of their classic old adventures for the 16-bit micros, in a similar fashion to what had happened with the pawn. The legendary original trio of Colossal Adventure, Adventure Quest and Dungeon Adventure, previously known as the Middle-earth trilogy, would be given a glow-up in 1986, although a lot of the more direct Tolkien references were removed. As a result, the trilogy was given the new name of Jewels of Darkness. Also in 1986, a more science fiction based trilogy of games, Snowball, Return to Eden and The Worm in Paradise, would also be compiled into a single box release named Silicone Dreams, giving the games a new lease of life and, again, like a lot of Rainbird's titles, trying to break North America further with these classic British text adventures. As for Magnetic Scrolls, they were busy working on their next, all-new adventure. With the pawn finally reaching a satisfying conclusion, the team decided to stay in the fantasy land of Coovnia for their next title, 1987's The Guild of Thieves. Rob Steggles would once again be the man to devise the story for the game, and Jeff Quilly would once again be providing those lovely graphics. The Guild of Thieves is a more straightforward and to-the-point game than the pawn. As the title suggests, you're aiming to become a fully fledged member of the Thieves Guild, and your mission is to sneak yourself into a mansion and nick anything inside that might be valuable. Once again, the box contains a whole load of goodies: an account card for the Bank of Coovnia, a What Burglar newsletter, and a contract for the Thieves Guild, amongst the usual nice manual and obviously essential discs. Naturally, these trinkets might also prove to be pretty useful in the game themselves, acting as a rather fancy sort of copy protection. The game itself doesn't change much when it comes to interface. It's the same as the pawn, and the artwork is still very nice indeed, both here and once again on the 8-bit version for the C64, which does a damn fine job of replicating the art despite the limitations, thanks to Tristan Humphreys. As far as text adventures go, the Guild of Thieves is a damn fine one. It feels like a real classic of the genre, fast-paced and with puzzles and logic that tends to make a lot more sense than the ones in the pawn. It's also here where the parser shows a lot more of its actual strengths, as opposed to the parlour tricks that it performed in the pawn. Now, I'm admittedly not the greatest player of these games, and I can find the text cumbersome, so it's very nice to be able to simply put in "take all" and put in case when confronted with a whole lot of items, or alternately, drop all items except X when I need to dump a bunch of them somewhere but leave a couple of others. That sort of thing is a huge quality of life improvement. The Guild of Thieves doesn't necessarily feature the same level of wit or indeed cruelty as the pawn, but it's a very sleek title, good enough to win a Golden Joystick Award for Best Adventure Game in 1987. Magnetic Scrolls had been around for a good couple of years now, and they had 2 main games under their belt. The Guild of Thieves was another successful title, although not quite as successful as the all-conquering pawn. The combination of Magnetic Scrolls and Rainbird, especially with Tony Rainbird in charge, proved very fruitful. Mind you, this would change a bit at the end of 1986, when Tony Rainbird decided to leave his namesake company. This was a bit of a blow for Magnetic Scrolls and Anita Sinclair. She had always got on very well with Tony, and his own love of adventures had definitely helped, but she didn't get on nearly as well with Paula Byrne, Tony's replacement, meaning things certainly got a bit more fractious between developer and publisher going forward. Indeed, it got to a point where Paula Byrne, in the press, made no secret of the fact that her and Anita Sinclair just didn't get on at all. It probably didn't help too much that the former boss of Rainbird could now be found at Magnetic Scrolls offices. Tony used the office as a base for a while when he was doing consultancy gigs, and even contributed the odd idea here and there. However, this friction didn't exist at all between the UK's two most famed text adventure houses. Magnetic Scrolls and Level 9 were far more friendly as opposed to being competitive, seeing as they were both under the wing of the same software house and so forth. In fact, the same could be said of the relationship between Magnetic Scrolls and Infocom. There was never really any heated rivalry between the two big names, and whenever the studios did get together, they would be happy to discuss shop with each other rather than bristle in each other's general direction. Indeed, the relationship between Magnetic Scrolls and Infocom could have been even closer at one point, as we will soon detail. Simply put, Anita Sinclair and the rest of Magnetic Scrolls never really believed in treating folks like Infocom as rivals, often sneaking plenty of references to the studio in their games, and this feeling was reciprocated over the pond. Perhaps in this spirit of good cheer, there was a subconscious understanding that time, maybe, was not on the side of the text adventure, with those two little yet foreboding words, graphic adventure, becoming more and more prominent, 1987 being the year of games such as Maniac Mansion, Leisure Suit Larry, and various other titles in that field, and that it made a lot more sense for the big text adventure houses to stick together rather than fight each other. But in 1987, the storm wasn't quite here yet. 1987 is also the time that Anita Sinclair found a relationship with a man by the name of Michael Bywater, a writer whose first job with Magnetic Scrolls was to create the various trinkets in the box of the Guild of Thieves. Bywater was pretty skilled with the pen, and he was a close friend of Douglas Adams. Indeed, he'd worked closely with Adams on 1987's Bureaucracy, his rather epic and exceptionally challenging text adventure for Infocom. Sinclair and Bywater were in a relationship for a couple of years, although generally they kept the personal and business sides of things separate. Bywater was, after all, going to become a rather important part of the studio's next game, something that would eventually be called Jinxter, and a title that had a somewhat tortured path towards completion. Before we get into that, it's perhaps a good time to look at how the press tended to deal with Anita Sinclair, who was certainly getting a lot more coverage in the magazines as her studio grew in prominence. She was, without a shadow of a doubt, the public face of Magnetic Scrolls. It's quite amusing, really, to look back at the coverage of Magnetic Scrolls games or interviews with her, seeing as magazines can't ever not pay an inordinate amount of attention to the fact that, well, you know, she's a woman, and this manifests itself in some rather amusing and cringy ways. Now, I should say quickly that I don't particularly mean to excoriate these old mags for some of the things they printed. It's quite funny more than anything, and it just shows how much of a different time it was. Take, for example, this utter gem from the Games Machine, the beginning of what should, ostensibly, be a review of the game Fish. Anita Sinclair looks fab. I've always liked the lady, but now that she's put on a little weight since giving up smoking, she looks gorgeous. What a pity that on the day she took me to lunch, oh do get on with it, Ed, she could barely walk due to some very painful blisters on her feet. She was also suffering from having a jolly good time at the Telecomsoft dinner the night before where the wine was free. Apart from discussing the PC show, other magazines, adventures in general, and her Audi Quattro, we did eventually get around to Magnetic Scrolls' new game, Fish. I mean, that's an interesting start to a review, isn't it? It's like a B-Tech Vanity Fair infused with the smell of a rotten Scotch egg. I think it's even funnier if you replace Anita Sinclair with someone else from the industry like, I don't know, David Braben, or Bruce Everis. It's not exactly the sort of copy that would be written if they were the ones being interviewed, is it? This fedora-tastic paragraph is one of the more extreme examples, but the gaming press as a whole did have something of a tendency to approach Anita Sinclair like a bunch of hormonal schoolboys. She did, after all, have a certain glamour to her that most of the magazine's other subjects, lacked somewhat. There would be other silly things. One magazine created a year-end award for Most Attractive Programmer, purely so that she could win it. Kind of a shame that this award hadn't existed previously, because I'm sure Jeff Minter could have picked up a couple of gons from it. No joke. Or utterly Partridgian lines from Sinclair users such as, "There is only one thing missing in your life. A fantastically beautiful and intelligent companion? I understand Anita Sinclair's already spoken for." when pushing a competition for a bloody Magnum light phaser, of all things. So what are Anita's thoughts about all this attention? Well, it was the logical move, really, for Anita to be the face of the company. Male or female, she was the headstrong one, and the confident one. Confident enough too, at one point during a CES show where magnetic scrolls were demonstrating the pawn, tell representatives of the Dark Lord himself, Jack Trammell, that he was going to have to come to their stand if he wanted to have a demonstration of the game. And make no mistake, Jack came running. Generally, Anita would happily pay a little lip service to the more giddy questions that came her way before moving things to the matter at hand, and she would always be counted on for a good quote. So there were plenty more reasons why she was always in high demand rather than just the basic milk-based ones. It was a bit frustrating at times, mind you. While Anita being the face of the company was absolutely the best move for business, Magnetic Scrolls was at heart a very collaborative company, one where there wasn't really a de facto boss or a sole designer or a head programmer or anything like that, and Anita did feel that there was too much emphasis on her. Going back to her interview in Mark Hardisty's Classic Adventurer, Anita recalls an example when she absolutely insisted that a journo spend more time talking to Hugh Steers than her. He talked to him for nearly an hour and Anita for only 5 minutes. And guess what? When the final copy came out, Anita was all over it. It's Anita's parser, Anita's code and so on, while Hugh Steers, who had done a great deal more of this parser and this code that they were talking about, was literally not mentioned at all. It's kind of funny, really. It reminds me of Anita's close friend who's not her relation, and his own public image. How the impression of Uncle Sir Clive was of a sole person, tinkering in his shed and building the Spectrum or whatever entirely by hand, by himself, when that really wasn't the case at all. A difference being that Anita and the rest of Magnetic Scrolls perhaps got slightly more annoyed by it at times. Let's move on to the subject of Magnetic Scrolls' third game, 1987's Jinxter, one which had a rather fraught development. The game was originally known as Green Magic, and the story had been written by Anita's sister Georgina. Rob Steggles was away at university at the time. Unfortunately, the relationship between Georgina and the rest of the Magnetic team during development was pretty strained. There was a heavy clash in styles, the design veered dangerously off course, there was a firm deadline from Rainbird that the game had to be ready by Christmas, and tensions were rising to the point of there being a potential break between the two sisters. Eventually, Georgina delivered a final draft of the story and said that she wanted nothing else to do with it. But Anita still wasn't satisfied at all. For her, in her words, the whole thing was just too bloody twee. Enter Michael Bywater to save the day. Initially, Anita simply wanted Michael to polish the text up a bit, but in a few weeks he pretty much rewrote the whole thing, with only the game's logic and basic structure still present. Obviously Michael wasn't able to change that at this late stage, but he did change the way that it was enacted, putting his spin on every last bit of descriptive text. It was at this point that the name of the game was changed. Exit Green Magic and enter Jinxter, something of an inside reference pointing towards just how jinxed the project had felt through most of its development. Still, it was just about delivered on time. Jinxter is an odd one, it's fair to say. Most call it Magnetic Scrolls' riff on Infocom's Enchanter. The setting is something of an urban fantasy, where a man must save the land of Aquitania from evil witches, doing so by obtaining several jewels and using them to cast spells. The game harks back to the pawn by painting the protagonist as a pretty average person who gets pushed and pulled around by forces out of his control, and it also harks back to the pawn by treating said man very badly indeed, and you will most certainly bear the brunt of that as a player. There is quite a bit of fun to be had, it must be said. The design can be a bit slapdash, with those jewels actually not playing as much of an important part as they were perhaps supposed to, in lieu of more traditional text-adventure puzzles, but there's quite a lot of fun to be had when it comes to the game's writing. Michael Bywater adds a lot of acerbic wit and silly goings-on to the game, much more so than there was in the more straightforward Guild of Thieves, and there is certainly plenty of laughs to be had. With all that said though, yeah, this game is cruel. Naturally, there's some seriously nasty puzzles to be had, especially near the end of the game, the sort that will really test the adventurer's appetite for moon logic. But that is far from the coolest part of the game. That would be an unseen and barely explained meter that measures our hero's luck. Luck is a big part of the game. Hell, the whole thing starts with you almost getting flattened by a bus until a guardian miraculously saves you and deems you fit for the task in hand. But other than that, it's something you may barely notice. If you spend too much time dithering about, or you screw up to a point where a guardian has to point you in the direction of what to do next, you may be told that you feel a little bit less lucky than you used to, and that's it. So, what happens if you run out of luck? Well, you'll die. At some thoroughly arbitrary point, just about at the end of the game, with no way to get that luck back. Without even knowing it, you'll have been playing a game that was unwinnable for all this time, with no choice except to go back to the beginning. That is, well, bastardry on a grand scale. It's absolutely dreadful, a mechanic that's nothing but evil in its creation. Perhaps the most annoying thing is that it seems to go against everything that Magnetic Scrolls games stand for. I mean, you have this complex parser, right? You trumpet games based on the freedom of this parser, how you can mess around with it, stick all sorts of things in there and it'll actually understand what you're talking about. Well, here's a game that will kill you for doing exactly that and messing about away from the goal, and it won't even bloody tell you that it's doing it until you're right at the fucking ending. I mean, good lord. Insert more hefty swear words here if you want, because, I mean, I would, but I don't want to get this video banned. Even with all of this, Jinxter still received very good notices. People generally enjoyed it, and despite some of the exquisitely evil nastiness in its game design, it is still an adventure that you can have a good laugh with, particularly if you share Michael Bywater's rather barbed style of humour. He certainly deserves a hell of a lot of credit for saving the day, performing a similar role as he did for Douglas Adams' Bureaucracy when it came to finally getting that title over the line. As ever, Jinxter comes with some excellent art and a lovely package containing a magazine, a beer mat, a memo and other cool trinkets. For most people, I do imagine the cash that was spent on Jinxter was money well spent. But once again, that number was less than the number who'd splashed out on Guild of Thieves. This, unfortunately, would be a common trend as we get later into the decade, a steady downward slope that, even though Magnetic Scrolls never actually made a bad game, was something that wasn't exactly in their control. It'll continue to bite as we move towards their next two titles, the last big ones that would be made with the old Eltham engine. As we head into 1988, Rob Steggles makes his way back from university. He asks his old friends at Magnetic Scrolls for a reference, but they end up offering him a job instead. In the time that he's been away, Magnetic Scrolls has certainly become a larger company. Not huge or anything, but there's certainly more people trundling around the office than the old mates Ken, Hugh and Anita. Is it a successful company? Well, they've certainly had successors, to be sure, although it's fair to say that they weren't exactly raking in millions of pounds. Magnetic Scrolls, as a company, didn't ever make a huge profit as such, and as we've mentioned already, their games were only decreasing in sales. Text adventures are seen as on the way out, while point-and-click games are very much on the way in. Despite this, Magnetic Scrolls have no desire to switch over to the hot new format. They don't particularly care for the more graphical adventures at all. Hell, it actually took Anita Sinclair a fair bit of convincing from Tony Rainbird a couple of years previously that some pictures should be added to 16-bit versions of the porn, even if the game certainly ended up a lot better for it. Text adventures are what Magnetic Scrolls want to do, and it's something they still think can live. They have a very secret project in the works that they hope will revitalise, even revolutionise the age-old genre, even if in the eyes of most people the commercial time of the text adventure was very nearly coming to an end. Indeed, the next Magnetic Scrolls game is something that's almost in defiance of the ever-contracting text adventure market, eschewing the more popular settings and genres for something altogether more niche. What? No fantasy? No surrealism? No quirky British humour? Nope, none of these things. Corruption, Rob Steggall's latest title, is marketed as a grown-up adventure, one that's set right in the present-day heart of ultra-capitalist and Thatcherite central London, where you play as a high-flying young executive in a financial company who uncovers the rotting core of insider trading within those beige walls, and has to move fast in the space of a single day in order to stop himself from taking the fall for other people's misdeeds. With allusions to drug use, attempts at murder, and a promised emphasis on solving puzzles through conversation as opposed to doing it in the traditional text adventure way, Corruption is a wholly different kettle of fish to anything that Magnetic Scrolls has created before, even if it still has the ever-familiar Elton Parser and the nice artwork, this time provided by Alan Honeysett and Richard Selby. The game originally had the title of Assassin while in development. For a long time it was thought that its working title was Upon Westminster Bridge, but this appears to be another unfinished and quite mysterious project entirely that Anita Sinclair was largely working on solo. Corruption is certainly intriguing, and not your usual text adventure, but I do think it misses the mark a little. The premise itself is very nice, as is the promise of being able to have detailed conversations and for the action to take place in something closer to real time, but it doesn't quite work out fully in practice, and the game does become very trial and error. While conversations are a part of the game, they don't really come into play until right at the finish, and a lot of your success in conversation depends on you having already amassed the evidence required to clear your name, which you've done in traditional text adventure fashion. The puzzles to do so mostly aren't that bad, although the one to get out of the hospital is admittedly quite fiendish indeed, but the biggest trial and error part is figuring out the times that people come and go from their usual haunts so that you can do them. It's the sort of thing where, once you've roughly figured out the movements of the people in the office through various failed attempts, you're still going to have to do a fair bit of waiting around and doing nothing before you can get on with the task at hand. And entering wait several dozen times doesn't really help a lot with the story that the game's trying to weave. You can wait until a certain time if you wish, which is handy, although there's more of a risk of screwing up by doing that. I don't mind the game at all, I think it's full of promise, and I'd have absolutely loved to see more text adventure games in this modern thriller vein, but it just needs to be that little bit tighter to really shine. As usual, Corruption comes with all the goodies that you would expect out of a Magnetic Scrolls package. You get a tape that features both John Malloy's excellent title tune and a recorded conversation that contains some useful info. There's that, ripped pages from a personal organiser, a casino chip, and the usual nicely done guides and so on. A lovely package. It's another pretty well-received title, but again, it's another one that suffers from increasingly diminishing commercial sales. Perhaps not a surprise, as something like this game is always going to be quite niche, but that combined with the state of text adventures meant that it was just never going to be much of a seller. It's also Rob Steggall's last game for Magnetic Scrolls. A year or so after this title, he would have a blazing row with Ken and Anita over wages, which would end with him walking out. By that time, the stress of the market's contraction was starting to hang over everybody, but we'll get to that. Before we move on to Magnetic Scrolls' next adventure, there's a few odd little tidbits when it comes to titles that didn't see the light of day. Specifically, a project that could have seen two of the biggest names remaining in text adventures getting together. For many, one of the most intriguing things about Magnetic Scrolls is their small role in possibly developing the long-awaited and much-hyped sequel to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game, Milliways, the restaurant at the end of the universe. This had been in the works, somewhat, since 1985. Douglas Adams had initially been quite enthusiastic about it, but then seemed to quickly lose interest, setting about the creation of bureaucracy instead, until he then kind of lost interest in that too in favour of his books, and gave it over to Michael Bywater. Bywater was moved to the US by Infocom in 1987 to specifically work on Milliways, but the arrangement proved unsatisfactory, and he was soon back in England, while Infocom's Amy Briggs was assigned to head the project. Then, in February of 1988, after she left, the ever more chaotic Infocom management announced that they were going to give the project over to Magnetic Scrolls with Michael Bywater designing, a move that infuriated the rest of the company, angered by a loss of creative control that hadn't happened previously in the history of Infocom. There was a fair bit of behind the scenes wrangling with Infocom getting it back, but it ultimately all became irrelevant when Infocom closed in 1989 after Activision shut down the office, sealing the door on a possible Hitchhiker's sequel for good. Times are starting to get a great deal harder for magnetic scrolls, that's for sure. But sometimes, when things are taking a turn for the worse, a studio can suddenly produce something really high quality indeed. And that's exactly what Magnetic Scrolls did. Their next game, Fish, from late 1988, is seen by a lot of text adventure and studio fans as the best thing the company ever did. A magnificent story that contains everything good about Magnetic Scrolls games, while leaving out most of the bad. The idea for this game came about thanks to a conversation between John Malloy, Magnetic's music man, and two friends of his, Phil South and Pete Kemp. Apparently they were on a bus, spouting off weird ideas for games at each other, and one of them said, "What if you started the game as a goldfish and you have to save the world?" Somehow this idea stuck, and it would become the basis for the game. The management loved the idea, and suddenly this trio had their foot in the door, writing and programming this weird little game. Now, if you think that some of Magnetic's other adventures have ventured far into the surreal, then Fish takes everything to another level. It's a game of interdimensional espionage where you do indeed play as a goldfish who has to save the world from a group of anarchists called the Seven Deadly Fins. You do this by travelling through warps in your goldfish bowl and taking over the body of someone else, usually a human, meaning that this adventure is going to take you absolutely all over the place. The writing throughout is absolutely top drawer, the best in any Magnetic Scrolls game for my money, not just when it comes to picturing the scenes, but also thanks to the tremendous wit. It's full of memorable one-liners and settings, and even the aquatic-based puns, which, let's face it, the game could have consisted almost entirely of, always seem to stick the landing. The puzzles aren't all that bad either. There's hard stuff for sure, but there's nothing here that you wouldn't expect to find in a text adventure, really. When you add the usual presentation to all of this, the lovely pictures, the various cool trinkets, yeah, I would agree with most of the folk who say that Fish is Magnetic Scrolls' best work. If you're interested in playing their games, I think that this is the one you should start on, even more so than the much more famous Pawn. It's one of the best text adventures ever made, and it really should have been a success. But sadly, it wasn't at all. And this time, it was for more reasons than the continuing contraction of the text adventure market. Just as Fish came out around Christmas of 1988, something happened that would change everything, and not for the better. This is, after all, right around the time that BT told Telecomsoft that they were going to be sold off, and naturally that includes all the labels. Commercially, Fish never stood a chance. Thanks to all of this chaos, the game came out with virtually no promotion at all, and it didn't sell too well, even compared to other text adventures of the time. A huge shame indeed for such a great title. By this time, the relationship between Magnetic Scrolls and Rainbird was very much at the breaking point. They didn't get on all that well after Tony left, and the diminishing sales were only making things worse there. One presumes that Rainbird tried to cajole Magnetic Scrolls into creating more commercially friendly titles, and that the response from Anita Sinclair and company was quite the resounding no. With the sale of Telecomsoft looming, Magnetic Scrolls knew that the writing was on the wall. They were quite certain that whoever picked up the company wouldn't wish to continue publishing their adventures, and their instincts were proved right when Microprose became the new owners. They had interest in some of the groups that had agreements with Telecomsoft, particularly the likes of Argonaut and Realtime, but as far as the group from London that make bloody ancient text adventures goes, yeah, that's not happening. Magnetic Scrolls no longer have a publisher. More than that, they'll enter into a rather brutal legal battle over the next year or so with Microprose in order to get the rights to their old games back. They still have a project that they hope is a big ace up their sleeve, but that obviously continues to demand that money be fed into it at all times. Anita Sinclair described 1989 as the year of horrendous collapse, and this could be applied to the world of text adventures as a whole. 1989 is the year that the almighty Infocom closes its doors for good. It's also the year that Level 9 announced that they're going to leave text adventures behind, releasing their final one, Scapegoat, in the winter. A couple of years later, they too will close. Mosaic Publishing, Vicky Khan's outfit, had closed the previous year following a rather intriguing text-based licensed game for the satirical BBC comedy Yes Prime Minister. If you asked most people about text adventures in 1989, they'd probably tell you that the genre, commercially at least, was dead. On the personal side of things, it's also the time when Anita Sinclair and Michael Bywater broke up, meaning that he now leaves this particular picture. However, magnetic scrolls were nothing if not Defiant, even if they were now the last ones standing. One thing that did help in this period was a wealthy background. Anita Sinclair in particular did have a fair bit of personal and familial finance to call on, and they probably wouldn't have survived 1989 without it. Another thing that helped was a new venture, one that saw Anita partner up with Tony Rainbird, that big old and rather familiar name called Special Reserve, the ones who would be masters of the mail order business in the first half of the 1990s. Tony Rainbird was a huge fan of adventures and was one of the few people who still believed somewhat in the genre. Therefore, one part of the Special Reserve empire was a sister mail order company called Official Secrets, one that was entirely centred around adventure games and also a company through which people could purchase official solution books for Magnetic Scrolls games, get the monthly Confidential magazine, amongst others. Even more than that, however, membership to the club also granted you an exclusive game created by the masters themselves, a little title that went by the name of Myth. Myth is, of course, the smallest of the Magnetic Adventures. Created solely by a young man named Paul Findlay, with Jeff Quilly returning to provide a few more nice pics, the game is set in ancient Greece, and as the inlay says, it recounts the struggles of the Olympian deities as they battle to maintain their religious monopoly in the face of the gathering storm of Christianity. One could almost see text adventures as the Greek deities, and point and clicks as Christianity. It's all quite simple, really, with a few nice pictures. To be honest, most of the short game will be spent either playing cards with Charon the Ferryman, or figuring out how to get a bunch of keys across the river Styx. Not a particularly consequential game, but not a terrible one. And hey, it came free with the membership. Unfortunately, Official Secrets wasn't enough to change the fortune of the text adventure. Membership was never quite enough for it to be profitable, and after 2 game yet unfertile years, Official Secrets was closed up. I've repeatedly mentioned that Magnetic Scrolls still felt like they had one more ace up their sleeve, a project that had been worked on since 1987. Despite all the awful setbacks of 1989, the end of the year did see them find a publisher who would bring their new vision for the text adventure to the market. With one more hail of publicity, a deal was announced between Magnetic Scrolls and Virgin. Yep, it's Anita Sinclair and Richard Branson. So what exactly is this big project? It's something that will replace the old Elton Parser, a new concept called Magnetic Windows. The name is somewhat similar to Microsoft Windows, yes, but this was a time when Windows was still not exactly welcomed by all, and hardly the world beater that it would become. Magnetic Windows will allow even more freedom for the text adventure. You have an interface that's much like a GUI, where there's one window for the story itself, another for the picture, another for a map, another for a compass, and so on. Doing this could allow for the inclusion of some proper cutscenes, which their next game would indeed have, and the user would be able to click on those images for further information, which they couldn't do before. And of course, the player would be able to manipulate these windows in whatever layout they saw fit. It's a bold move indeed, something that Anita and the rest of Magnetic Scrolls greatly believed in. The final gambit, the final defiant move against the dying of the light. The concept and story for the first Magnetic Windows game, Wonderland, came from a man named David Bishop. As you might have guessed, the game is based on the adventures of Alice in Wonderland, promising you the chance to step into Lewis Carroll's spellbinding imagination. Alice is always a good base for an adventure, of course, even if this isn't exactly transmogrifying goldfish like the last game. Still, the new interface for the adventure was perhaps more important than the adventure itself. The idea for a windowed text adventure was kicking around inside of Anita Sinclair's head since 1987, and she may have possibly used one of her own personal projects, the unreleased Upon Westminster Bridge, as a testbed for the concept. Thanks to this interface, as well as various other games and the aforementioned issues the company faced, Wonderland would spend 3 years in development, although this lengthy development didn't necessarily hurt the game that much, with the end adventure itself actually being one of the company's cleanest and most efficient. The interface, though, was everything. From about 1989 onwards, all hands were on deck to sort this out, and on reflection it's pretty impressive. They were trying to recreate Microsoft Windows on a budget of damn near nothing. They looked beyond this first title too. They hoped that if Wonderland and Magnetic Windows was a success, that it would revolutionise the adventure industry. It would be a shot of adrenaline right in the heart of the text adventure. Everyone would want to come to Magnetic Scrolls to use their system, and they'd be very happy to license it out. That was the dream, of course. Alas, when Wonderland finally arrived on the shelves in late 1990, none of that happened. Wonderland, and the ambition of Magnetic Windows as an interface, certainly warrants some credit. It's a bold move. One can really appreciate just how defiant Magnetic Scrolls were as a company, and it comes through here. The adventure game itself is also absolutely fine. The generally good things about all Magnetic games, from the writing to the artwork, which now includes several quite lengthy cutscenes, has certainly not diminished in the new interface. But it was pretty far from perfect. The trouble with Wonderland was that it absolutely guzzled memory. If you had too many windows open, it wouldn't be long before the game started to run like a total pig, and you'd be kindly asked to kill a bunch of the windows so that the game could actually start whirring again. If you were playing the game on an Amiga 500, you would probably get that a hell of a lot. It's one of those cruel twists of fate, isn't it? Microsoft themselves had a great deal of trouble establishing Windows and convincing people that a GUI was better than a simple and fast command line. It wouldn't even start to stick until the release of 3.0, again in 1990. And Magnetic Scrolls had the exact same trouble with Magnetic Windows. For the seasoned text adventure player, the new interface may have looked nice, but most people preferred the efficiency of simply typing into a parser, something that wasn't going to be quite as taxing on a computer's memory. For those who may not be so familiar with the genre, well, again, it looked nice, but for all the nice sheen on this interface, once you peel it all away, it is still a text adventure. That, and we're now in the 1990s. What's happening in the world of those point and clicks that the studio hates so much? Well, The Secret of Monkey Island was released a month or so before Wonderland, and that's probably all you need to know. The point and click is about to enter the golden age, and the text adventure, well, again, for most people, it's dead, and nothing's going to change that. Wonderland was the all-in project for Magnetic Scrolls. They put absolutely everything into it, and sadly the game flopped. With this flop came something of a grim acceptance of inevitability. They did manage to settle their lawsuit with Microprose and get the rights to their old games, and through doing this they were able to re-release a couple of them in 1991, the first and only Magnetic Scrolls collection featuring Guild of Thieves, Corruption and Fish, now playable in the new Magnetic Windows environment. Again, this didn't sell, and Virgin dropped Magnetic Scrolls shortly after. Their very final game that wasn't a text adventure, perversely, actually saw them work under Microprose. It's a rather obscure RPG called The Legacy Realm of Terror that only came out for PC-DOS in 1993, and to be honest it wasn't something that would have impressed fans of the genre at that time. Indeed, it doesn't appear as though the company's heart was ever into it at all. They folded halfway through the game's development, leaving Microprose to put other people on the project to finish it. Finally, Magnetic Scrolls recognised, with a heavy heart, that their time was up. It should be noted that unlike a bunch of companies that we've covered previously, they didn't go fully bankrupt, and that they wound up their business in a professional manner with no debts to speak of. They just, at last, knew that they were finished. The reason why was pretty straightforward. Magnetic Scrolls could no longer make the games they wanted to make and get them published. Text adventures were what they wanted to do, but commercially the genre was thought of as a dead duck, no matter how they were presented. Even when bigging up Wonderland in interviews, Anita Sinclair essentially admitted that the main motivation behind Magnetic Windows was to truss up the old text, to make it something of a gimmick that would hopefully bring new people to interactive fiction. But unfortunately, it didn't work. When you look at the magazines, you see that the coverage of IF is becoming minuscule. The likes of Amstrad Action's Bulwark, Tim Kemp at Your Sinclair and the late great Keith Campbell are still batting, but their inches are getting smaller and smaller by the issue, with less and less new games to cover. It appears as though the text adventure is entering a dark age. The closure of Magnetic Scrolls in 1992, the last big name in text adventures, meant that from a commercial perspective, the genre had finally reached midnight. It's worth spending a little bit of time here, at the end, to talk a bit about what happened next, and the various fates of these people. Because after all, there's a lot of people out there who still love text adventures, for whom the genre has never died in their heart. Indeed, while magazines might have said that text adventures were dead, there were always lights in the darkness. Smaller companies like Zenobi, who sold adventures to people through mail order during the last days of the 8-bit micros and beyond. There's some pretty good things to highlight here too when it comes to the people who've kept the games of Magnetic Scrolls alive, just as others have done for the likes of Infocom. Since 1997, a man named Stefan Meyer has maintained a website by the name of the Magnetic Scrolls Memorial, and if you want to know anything about the history of the company, this is undoubtedly the place to go to. You've got full details on all of the games, recollections from people like Rob Steggles, interviews from the past, and all sorts of other magazine scans. Basically, if it's anything that's related to Magnetic Scrolls, chances are good that it's probably here. However, more than that, Meyer's website also includes a way to experience the games for yourself in your web browser, something called Magnetic Scripts. You can click on the info for any game, and you can also play it too, something designed to preserve the games and prevent them from being lost. As far as I can tell, Magnetic Scripts has been on the website for most of its existence, with the knowledge and blessing of both Ken Gordon and Anita Sinclair. Over the years, other fans have also built Magnetic Scrolls interpreter programs. There's Nicholas Carlson's Magnetic and Thomas Detbarn's D-Magnetic, for example. They've certainly made sure of a few ways to play these games that aren't just loading up an emulator. Moreover, Meyer and Hugh Steers formed Strand Games in 2016. Strand doesn't just look to preserve the old games, but to remaster them, and once again it has the blessing, as well as participation, of a lot of the old Magnetic Scrolls folk. The Pawn, Guild of Thieves and Jinxter are available in a new remastered form for a couple of quid apiece, and can also be played quite efficiently on mobile phones if you wish. As far as preservation goes, Strand were finally able to recover the source code for the original Magnetic Scrolls games, accessing the solitary existing 30-year-old tape backup of the code with the help of a quick spot of bacon in the oven. Aside from all this excellent work, where are the denizens of Magnetic Scrolls today? A lot of them are still ploughing their trade around computers of various sorts. Ken Gordon, for example, works at Microsoft, while Rob Steggles is in telecommunications. Jeff Quilly, the man behind most of those wonderful pictures, is now a professor of arts at the University of Sussex, while Michael Bywater has quite a prolific career as a journalist, columnist and author under his belt. John Malloy, the music composer and a big part of The Almighty Fish, sadly passed away of cancer in 2018. And what of the most visible of them all? As far as games go, Anita Sinclair has been somewhat quiet since the Magnetic Scrolls days, with not much of a footprint to be found on the internet. She has surfaced a couple of times to recount the old days, but not often. Before her excellent 2018 interview with Mark Hardesty for The Classic Adventurer, she hadn't been seen in the press for many years, perhaps not since a 2001 article in PC Zone. She seems to have other passions nowadays, particularly when it comes to cards. A love of poker was always something that she shared with her good friend Sir Clive over the years, but her biggest strength is bridge. A profile on the English Bridge Union website reveals that she's won plenty of trophies in the game over the years, and there's a few instances of Anita talking about her love of the game. And so, the book closes on Magnetic Scrolls. It's quite the story indeed, bigger perhaps than even I realised, and one that spans from the heyday of the text adventure right up to the bitter end, at least from a commercial perspective. Even as someone who went into this without too much knowledge about text adventures, admittedly, learning about what makes a good text game tick, as well as this company, has been quite the joy. And I absolutely admire Magnetic for their defiance, even when all appeared to be rather hopeless. They are a truly great company. Not exactly the most prolific, with only a few games over their existence, but none of those games are what you'd call bad or boring. They're all trying to do something quite novel in their own way. It's been a pretty fun ride to track their tale, and hopefully people will continue, even if it may be a drip, to discover the work that they did. Next time in the Telecom Soft universe, we'll be looking at something a bit flashier. It's the turn of Argonaut, with a bit of real-time games to go along with it. So yeah, the companies certainly keep getting bigger. But until then, it's time to say, as ever, bye for now.